Welcome back to Ryan Rambles, the one where I tend to go on, the podcastly show where I tend to go on and on about things. And I had this crazy idea where I do a run of episodes. And again, I don't normally do videos for these ones, but it's going to be especially appropriate for this series of episodes, or at least this one. I guess I don't know if I'll do a video version for all of these coming up, but I'm going to do a run of episodes about the Marvel comic book character Moon Knight. But it probably will get a little messy, and I'll tell you why, because I used to do this thing, basically, whenever a new comic book show or movie would come out, where I'd use it as an excuse to basically go back and read up on a bunch of books that I missed out on at some point. When I collected comics back in the 90s, it was a real scattershot affair, with the exception of maybe Wolverine, X-Men, and X-Force, I think, were probably my big three. So I got a bunch of those in a row, but otherwise I got just bits and pieces here and there, maybe a few grab bags even. So whenever these shows would come up, I'd be like, great, let's go back and read some of these seminal stories that I always missed out on, because that's the other thing is back in the 90s, I wasn't buying for stories, maybe hardly at all. I just had artists that I loved, I had characters that I loved, and you know, sometimes that's as far as you went. So I've done this for Infinity War when that kind of happened, even though there was probably less to garner from the books with that one. But I had collected those back when I believe the Infinity Crusade and War did their primary run there. So that was an easy one for me. Reread those. Did the same thing for WandaVision, which went over a bunch of books. Same with Black Widow, Hawkeye, even Suicide Squad, so this isn't necessarily all Marvel focused, but last I did, I think was for, no, actually, I was going to say the Eternals, which I did do and stalled out because I think I started in on what I'm about to talk about on Moon Knight. So I'll finish that up later. Maybe I'll do another one of these episode runs later for Eternals. But the very last one I did this for was Secret Invasion. So you've probably noticed that there's a lot less payoff, or has been at least a lot less payoff with this technique of mine. But I'm not necessarily in it for that, because these stories have been great for the most part. You know, it might get frustrating when you see the shows and think, you know, it was right there. It was all right there. And I know adaptation is kind of its own discipline all on its own, but for the most part, great stories. For the most part, great shows too. Some maybe more than others, obviously. But when I heard that we're going to do a Moon Knight show, which still kind of blows me away, honestly. I guess that and the Eternals still, like, the Eternals is such a big swing though. Moon Knight is a strange swing, let's say, instead. And I think we'll definitely get into that throughout the course of this very show right here. But when I heard they were going to do a show, it was kind of an easy one for me. I had always liked the character, and ever since I was a kid, so for one of those like ethereal reasons that, again, who knows? I can't think of an artist, you know, that I latched onto about him. I think it might have been all the look at that point when I was a kid. I latched onto Moon Knight for whatever reason. I collected the first back in the day. In fact, I want to say this is still the oldest. Actually, I don't know, because I've acquired some since, but certainly back when I was collecting in the 90s, this was the oldest comic book I ever had. And I think I got it in a trade even. But I had never gone the full nine, never started picking up a book of his, never followed any of the stories, just kind of followed from afar and just kind of, again, liked what I saw. So here's my opportunity to, again, go back and catch up on all these stories, catch up on this character even. So I just started reading. I started with his first appearance, and I just kept going. I still haven't watched the show. This is over 2 years ago at this point. So I've been reading Moon Knight books, I guess you could say off and on, but just because I straight up read off and on. So for 2 years, I've been off and on reading the last 40 years of Moon Knight. I think we're coming up, I think that's what it is, on the 40-year anniversary next year. Yeah, 40 years. So that's why this might get a little bit messy, because not only am I trying to remember what I read 2 years ago, I'm trying to compress 40 years of comics, which I'm not entirely, I'll tell you how I made my selections, but for that reason, if I get a little bit flustered, a little bit messy here and there, just give me a second. Because as usual, I am coming at this as more of a fan than an expert. So if you want to come in and be the expert, that's something you should invite people to do on the internet. If you want to do that, throw some corrections my way, whatever, I don't care. I'm open to all of it. So come help out in a way. In fact, the first expert I'll call out, which I don't actually know if he's an expert, but he's expertly created an expert document. His name is, quite possibly, Orion Petitclerc. It's his name or his job, I don't know. But he created this document, this Google spreadsheet, and I'm going to link all this stuff below in the description, that tracks, I think, every single appearance of Moon Knight, although I will flex here a little bit. I did find some he didn't catch, because every now and then, you'll find a letter or a comment from the editor that's like, this is continuing the storyline from this. So whenever I was able to find something that wasn't on the list, it was obviously like a panel or two, and there's a lot on here, because again, these are just appearances that are inconsequential, to say the least. So I don't need to talk about most of these, and the way I went about it is that I didn't. So at first I was like, what if I did a top 10? And then by the time I was done with the top 10, I was like, oh, those are the 10 that I want to talk about anyway. So it fit. Also, we might do a second episode of honorable mentions, if that sounds interesting to anybody else. So for now, here are the top 10 in chronological order, by the way. Top 10 Moon Knight comic books over his last 40 years that I read within the last 2 years that I want to mention. And I will start on May 27th, 1975 with Werewolf by Night number 32 through 33, where Doug Moench, and I'll list these in order of writer and then artist, where Doug Moench and Don Perlin created Moon Knight. And I guess what had happened was that Doug Moench was on most of Marvel's horror books at that point. Horror comics have always been not only a big thing, but quite possibly what helped launch or popularize, in some aspects, comic books in general. And Doug Moench was doing most of those for Marvel. So when the werewolf book, Werewolf by Night, which actually tells the story of a werewolf by the name of Jack Russell, which probably sounded a lot more funny until, again, Disney literally did a Werewolf by Night show with Jack Russell in there that also has Man-Thing? Just who can... Anyway, Moon Knight actually begins in Werewolf by Night as, obviously, an antagonist for Jack Russell, although maybe not obviously, because I honestly never got the connection. He's, a werewolf, the moon, he's Moon Knight. That's might be as far as they got, but Moon Knight himself wasn't the impetus behind that anyway. He was put out there to capture Jack Russell by a committee, or the committee, which would also pop up later on, and gave them his costume and his title. Like, there's panels where he's like, they told me to call myself Moon Knight and wear this thing, and I think it's kind of dumb, or forget the actual phrasing, but again, I'm putting the pictures up there, so just go read it on the side there. But with his introduction, we actually do get some players that continue on through the entirety of the Moon Knight mythology. We get Frenchie, who is actually Jean-Paul Duchamp, that is kind of his sidekick, flies his helicopter for the most part, and Marlene, who is the love interest. I believe she is, actually I don't know when this actually happens, but she's the daughter of the archaeologist. That is a retcon, actually, yes, we'll get to it. That is, I think, unearthing the Khonshu statue. I'm getting very ahead of myself here. For now, she's the love interest. And if you're into how things begin, okay, I'll tell you two things. If again, like me, I like to see where things begin, how they started. If you're into that, you're going to love this. Also, if you just straight up like good writing, because Doug Moench has a way with words. I clipped this, which actually I have been tweeting these over the years when I get to a new book and I do kind of a summary, but I didn't thread them together. I'm tempted to go through on Threads and repost them in an actual properly threaded form, but failing that, welcome to the show. But I posted this panel by Doug Moench where Moon Knight has, it's in 33, I believe, Werewolf by Night 33, where Moon Knight has found Jack Russell, and they are wrestling underneath the pier of a nearby waterfront. I don't know. And this is how Doug Moench puts it through the eyes of Moon Knight. The water shot fire through my shattered hand, made it throb like a hiccuping balloon. But what was that compared to the beast's life and death, lust for vengeance? Answer, bright nothing wrapped in pretty bows of bloody violence. So we fought, both struggling to escape hell. So it's good, and I'm not going to say that overall, and I don't have a great feel for how this book itself, Werewolf by Night, was with its mythology, so to speak, but the minute by minute, word by word of Doug Moench is a delight. And it continues with the second book I want to mention, which is in October of 1978 and is not a Moon Knight book either. It's not even technically a comic book. It's The Hulk! Number 11 through 15, 17 through 18, and 20, which was a magazine. In fact, if I am putting up those pictures, you can tell me, I believe was under the Curtis imprint at the time, was another publisher that was actually Marvel. But in this magazine, there was a bunch of Hulk, obviously, but then on the back half, there would be kind of it wasn't a hero of the week because these stories continued, but what happened was that Ralph Macchio, no, not that Ralph Macchio, had become an associate editor for Marvel early on in his career and was given at least this magazine, Hulk magazine, and said had gone through some ideas of maybe putting Shanna the She-Devil or Submariner in the last half, but eventually chose Moon Knight. Got Moench, and Moench cycles through a few different artists you will see, Gene Colan, Keith Pollard, until finally he found a 19-year-old new hire in the form of Bill Sienkiewicz. So, the art's good at the very least, but also I would say this is the first wholly Moon Knight story, but also the first good Moon Knight story. So that's why I'm recommending this one. It has a stab at a nemesis in Moon Knight's brother Randall, who's kind of a hatchet man, serial killer guy that you get the feeling they didn't expect would be back, given how he exits the story, so to speak, but he does come back to mixed effect. But we'll get to that later. The next I want to call out is the actual Moon Knight solo book, version 1 from 1980, November of 1980 even. Still Moench at the helm, and he was able to bring Sienkiewicz along with him. And he gets to basically fine-tune the character at this point, which he had been attempting to do throughout other books that I might get to in, again, the second episode of this, where we do some honorable mentions of sorts. But for now, he's using this one to introduce a new origin, which still kind of fits with Werewolf by Night, but is more Moon Knight specific, as you might imagine. And it does involve Khonshu, the Egyptian god of a few things that does change over time. So I'll just mention it by name at this point. And then, as almost an afterthought in this book, because this is the other thing that I feel like Moon Knight is known for, multiple identities. And we'll come back to that multiple times even. But for now, this first solo book is definitely where I think the Moon Knight we all know and love, or that has come to have been iterated on throughout the years, is this one. And again, I'm recommending it because it's a great book. Sienkiewicz and Moench both just kill it for 30, I think it goes to 33, and they're not the leads on every single one of those, but for the majority, you almost can't go wrong. They start bringing in some, I guess, rogues. Like this is where they create his rogue gallery kind of for the first time, or it's at least where all the first appearances are. There's a guy named Morpheus that's kind of in charge of dreams in a dream world of sorts. There's Bushman, which is the guy that comes back the most. He is this Joker type, I guess you could say. He doesn't have, although he does have the face paint going on, he doesn't necessarily have that gimmick. Like his gimmick is just, he looks like he lives in the bush and carries around a big knife that he kills people with a lot. They struggle with an absolute nemesis for Moon Knight for some time, I'm going to say. Let's put it that way. That Stained Glass Scarlet might actually be my personal favorite, at least, and maybe the one that comes closest to actually antithesizing, is that a word? The character of Moon Knight and everything that's set up within this book specifically. Speaking of which, the other thing you're still going to see is Frenchie still flying that helicopter. Marlene is here again. This is where she's codified as that archaeologist's daughter that just, I think, halfway doesn't necessarily... so if you don't know the, I guess, origin of Moon Knight that does repeatedly pop up, it's the one that, like, if you barely know anything about Moon Knight, this is probably the origin you know, no matter how many times it's been tinkered with. He was a mercenary out in Egypt somewhere. He died in the desert and clawed his way to a crypt of some sort where the Khonshu statue was, died in front of the statue, and then the statue or Khonshu himself brought him back to life. And that's the question, depending on the book we're going to talk about. Did that actually happen? Didn't it? Etc. We'll find out, or won't. But this is where that pops up for the first time and completely replaces the semi-origin before that was toyed with in some of those books I might mention later, where he actually was bitten by Jack Russell and acquired some sort of moon powers because of it. They don't always talk about the bite. I feel like somebody floated that and got it into a book out of nowhere, and then nobody else was up for it. So they kind of turn that into just moon powers. You know, when the moon is full, he's more powerful. When it's not, he's not, that type of thing. The whole Khonshu stuff pretty much replaces all that completely. So Mensch and Sienkiewicz are pretty much at the helm until 33-ish again. In 37 is where his Jewish roots, Moon Knight's Jewish roots, or Mark Spector's, I can't remember which identity. I think it's Mark Spector. I believe that is kind of the main identity. It was always the alter ego that I knew the most. So I think that is the one that is actually Jewish. It sounds very weird to talk about it like this, but in 37 through 38, the book is picked up by Alan Zelenetz, who subbed in for more than a few, I want to say, over the years, and would actually take up version 2 of the book. I think it's subtitled Fist of Khonshu, but people just call it Moon Knight version 2. And it didn't take off. Like, it went for, I think, 6 issues, and that last issue is kind of a weird one, although it does feature, I believe, a Sienkiewicz cover, because he would keep... After this, I don't think Sienkiewicz ever returned to a Moon Knight story, to doing pencils for a Moon Knight story, but he would do a lot of covers over the years. They would have him sub in, not even just alternates, like he would do the covers for a lot of stuff that we'll go on to talk about. But yes, 37 through 38 is a pretty good story you can pick up where his Jewish roots are kind of solidified, and he beats up a bunch of Nazis. So, okay. Moving on to the fourth book I want to talk about. Yes, only the fourth book. I'll try and speed this up. In July of 1987, because after that version 2 kind of failed to start, and this is one of my regrets with this episode, is that I'm not going to be able to tell you almost any reasons why any books were discontinued. Like, I don't know if sales were faltering. I don't know if, you know, some of these were miniseries and always proposed as miniseries, or if they were like, let's see if we can launch Moon Knight again, and then they failed. I don't know. I can only assume in some cases. So version 2 did not take off for whatever reason, planned or otherwise. So Moon Knight does not have a solo book again until 1989, but it's not quite the Dark Ages because, again, in July of 1987, he joins the West Coast Avengers. And this is technically the version 2 of the book because I believe the first West Coast Avengers was a miniseries of sorts. So if you're looking for it, again, it's the one in 1987. But in book number 22 through 41, Steve Englehart and Al Milgrom basically create this ensemble piece with Iron Man, Dr. Pym, Tigra, Espirita, Wonder Man, Hawkeye, Mockingbird. Those are kind of the core group of West Coast Avengers for this run, along with Moon Knight when he does officially join in 33, I think. I deleted that note because I thought I wasn't going to mention it. But the Steve Englehart, Al Milgrom run on West Coast Avengers is poppy and pulpy and fun. Not that it's just far more serious. Moon Knight version 1, far more serious than this book, which is just... at one point, Yetrigar from Godzilla shows up, like within a normal storyline. So it is a comic book man's comic book. And as such, the way it deals with Khonshu is completely different. Like, he is real. Like, there's no question about it, no question mark as to Moon Knight's sanity necessarily in that regards, which is more of a question later on in the books we'll talk about. But here, he straight up talks to Khonshu, like in the middle of fights, and he talks, you could say, religiously. He talks a lot to him, but also with an air of religiosity for the first time. So that's kind of where this is popping up. In fact, at one point, he, like, whenever Mark Spector goes unconscious, like, Khonshu just takes over and is Moon Knight. And I want to say that happens for several issues, actually, until finally they take Moon Knight to Damon Hellstrom, which, if I had to guess, was kind of Marvel's Constantine. And he casts out Khonshu from Moon Knight finally. And I think they have kind of a face-to-face conversation, and Khonshu ends up leaving, which leaves Moon Knight a bit disillusioned. And the multiple personalities don't get any more of a nuanced treatment, let's say. In fact, this might be kind of the grossest use of it yet. They're up against a bad guy named Dominus Rex, and I believe, like, everyone else is hypnotized, including Moon Knight, until he just switches to one of his alternate personalities, and then he's able to escape. And they're like, "How did you do that?" And he's like, "I'm 3 people." Or it's not great, but it fits this book. Again, if that's something you're looking for, just poppy, pulpy fun, this is the one. But if you want to swing back in the other direction, let me tell you what happened in June of 1989 with Mark Spector Moon Knight. This is another one that I think comes up as like version 3 or 4, but is actually titled a little differently. You'll see that Mark Spector part of, before every title. And it's number 1 through 14, 19 through 21, and 25. And the reason I call out some numbers specifically sometimes is because, especially for the longer runs, which this is the longest running series of Moon Knight that's ever been still, I didn't read the entire thing. I read enough to get a feel. In fact, there are some that only go for 12 issues. So I think how I did it was I read for sure the first 12 issues of every book. And then if it referenced other stories, or if other books referenced, something that happened in the past books, I would go back and read those past books. So that's what it came out to be with this one. But since it did run for 60 issues, it's kind of multiple books in one that I have to talk about. So have a seat. This one might be a bit. It's launched by Chuck Dixon writing and Sal Belluto on pencils. It goes back to New York. I think for West Coast, he was obviously on the West Coast, as you might imagine. He goes back to his old costume for version 2. I didn't mention this, but they really upped the whole Egyptian aspect to Moon Knight, and that carried through for the most part in West Coast Avengers. They reset that. He's kind of back to his old costume for Mark Spector Moon Knight in 89. The Mooncopter is back, if I haven't mentioned that yet. Again, the thing that Frenchie flies most often, because again, Frenchie is back in the picture along with Marlene. And here is where, if they didn't codify the Rogues Gallery with version 1, they like 1,000,000% do it with this one. Bushman is back. Midnight is back, who was actually one of, I can't remember in which comic book. I'm probably posting it down below because I went back and looked now, but Midnight was an early enemy of his that in this one, his son has taken up the mantle and actually becomes his sidekick. So there's that. Also Brother Voodoo, Arsenal, which may not be the Arsenal you're thinking about, it turns out. And Stained Glass Scarlet is back again. And again, why I say this swings back in the other direction, because this is possibly more grounded than even version 1 was with Mensch and Sienkiewicz. There's actually no mention of powers at all, no mention of Khonshu, or there's like a tiny mention of his origin, kind of like you feel like they had to do something, but they drop it so quick. It just doesn't come back very often, if at all, along with any powers he might have, because basically this is the introduction of what I'm going to call the Batman problem from here on out, when people are trying to figure out what they can do with Moon Knight, especially if they're going to relaunch him or whatever. He just ends up being some version of Marvel's Batman. And here he is Mark Spector almost entirely. There's no multiple identities. and he's a millionaire, so he can afford all this stuff, and he just goes around fighting crime without powers. So that sounds familiar. That's the Batman problem when it comes to Moon Knight. The other caveat I'll give you with this book in particular is that it is, like, no books, especially at this time, were especially kind to women. We know that comic books in general have an issue with that. This one might be downright misogynistic. Just FYI, when Marlene is introduced, she doesn't want to sleep with Spectre, and he talks her into it. So reluctant sex, check. And then when she becomes something of a shrew, I believe him or Frenchie or somebody literally says the words "women" with like an exclamation point. And then she goes shopping and almost immediately becomes a damsel in distress after that. So fair warning as far as that goes. And I will say it eventually becomes just traditionally bad instead of especially bad. And a lot of that might have to do with, again, maybe the first transition that this book makes. Around issue 19, you get the feeling that they were trying to figure out something different for it. Not that nothing good came out of it. There's actually some really good guest covers by Jackson Guice, Dennis Cohen, and Rob Liefeld. So if you've wanted any, real indications that we'd entered the 90s, there they are. But it also resulted in this really cool trifold by Mark Bagley when he showed up in Amazing Spider-Man for a series that actually got the first one out of nowhere, the Round Robin Sidekicks Revenge. I believe Midnight tries to take revenge on Moon Knight at some point when he shows up in that story eventually, because he shows up in the last. This is the first of 6. He shows up in 6 of 6, and that's what that trifold comes from. So I'm tempted to say that Amazing Spider-Man, to some extent, weathered the 90s maybe better than a lot of comic books. That might have been by sheer force, sheer popularity of sorts, because I know there's plenty of controversial Spider-Man stories from the 90s that we might revisit here in a few. So, and in issue 25, which might actually be the real transitional issue for Mark Spector Moon Knight, Mark Bagley takes up pencils, and it's actually for a story written by Howard Mackie that mentions Khonshu, and Moon Knight wonders about his motivations, but it kind of becomes a one-off of sorts, because in May of 1991, the Scarlet Redemption storyline is picked up by J.M. DeMatteis and Ron Garney, with covers by Bill Sienkiewicz, again, which is definitely going to be what I put up on the screen right now. And it's really good, actually. It's something I would recommend checking out. They managed to bring in Khonshu, and they managed to revitalize Stained Glass Scarlet, which kind of whenever she shows up, it's a story you should probably check out. The one in version 1, if I didn't mention it, is fantastic as well. But they do a great job here of recontextualizing her a little bit to be his religious antithesis of sorts, because as time goes on, Moon Knight and the whole Khonshu origin is becoming more of a religious question to him, and I think to the writers in general. So with this, they're like, what if we take Stained Glass Scarlet, who's kind of always had her as you might be able to tell by the name Stained Glass, she's always had kind of a religious aspect to her. They take her and, turn her into this, again, probably favorite of mine, arch enemy of Moon Knight, even if they keep it pretty vague, which might also be why I like it. But with this storyline, he actually dies again-ish. Moon Knight does. And he's reborn under Khonshu again, question mark, as a god of justice or a defender of second chances this time, which again feels like somebody's at least taking care of the character. Whereas before, and even though I'm still recommending it with the caveat of the misogyny, with this Scarlet Redemption storyline, J.M. DeMatteis actually seems like they're interested in delving a little bit more deeply than had been done so far, and would be done, unfortunately, afterwards, because DeMatteis is out, and in 1992, with issue number 35, Terry Kavanagh is in. And if I mentioned possibly returning to Amazing Spider-Man stories that didn't quite hit in the 90s, Terry Kavanagh helped, at the very least, write the Clone Saga for Spider-Man. So if you have mixed feelings about the Clone Saga, Spider-Verse notwithstanding, you might have mixed feelings about what Terry Kavanagh did with Moon Knight in 1992 and beyond. Let me just read you my notes from this, because I barely understand them myself. BB has Punisher, Cult of Khonshu, Angel Wing? It's okay, or not, lol. He was in the chamber? Shadow Knight? Kill him for his power? But what power? God of Justice, not Vengeance? Part 4 is WTF. New Moon Knight costume, back to Hatchet Killer, stupid, Batman again. Frenchie paralyzed, Shadowkeep? Moon Car, question mark, question mark? This is the 90s. What a mess. Moon Knight did not weather the 90s especially well. And I grew up in the 90s, and I still read these books being like, wow, this is some 90s comic book storytelling right here. So if you can do that, you'll be incredibly happy, especially around October of 93 when Stephen Platt takes over as penciler, which if you've never seen Stephen Platt's material, which I don't know if I have yet either, to be honest, because he appears to be doing an exact mix of Rob Liefeld and Todd McFarlane. Look it up. It's almost uncanny. And I think he knows it because I think he has an After McFarlane in his signature at some point, but he heads up some stories where Frenchie is literally paralyzed, but also turns out is of the bloodline, or has bloodline ancestors that are also the Knights Templar, or he joins them under that because the Elder Gods Hellbent, which are followers of Thoth, have figured out. And then Moon Knight dies, if you didn't see that coming somehow. So much so that he doesn't show up for 4 years anywhere. And I don't mean like he doesn't have a solo book for 4 years. I mean he does not have an appearance for 4 years. And this is also when the comic book market and medium crashed to some extent. So all boats were rising with the tide when Mark Spector Moon Knight was going on, and fell when the crash happened. So eventually in January of 1998, they give it another shot, and they do it in the absolute right way. It's a storyline called Resurrection War by Doug Moench with pencils by Tommy Lee Edwards, who I'm unfamiliar with, but absolutely knocks it out of the park for this thing. And it's pretty much a total reset. It alludes a little bit to what happened with his death and stuff like that. Again, you kind of get the feeling because they had to, but Khonshu's back in it. It's a really cool storyline versus Set. They keep with some of the Egyptian going on there. And almost every rogue, I want to say, has a role in this single storyline. It's a bit unstable, as is Moon Knight himself. He's kind of uncertain with his resurrection, why it happened. Again, it puts the question mark back in Khonshu for the most part, and they leave it up to the reader to some extent. And I'm back in wholeheartedly. Check out the story. It's only 4 issues, and it does hinge on his faith in Khonshu a little bit, so I don't know if that's a turnoff for you automatically, but basically Doug Moench is back. Moon Knight is back, and that's it. This is one of those where I don't know if it was meant to signify a relaunch or what, but it doesn't go anywhere until almost exactly a year later in 1999, they try it again with a storyline called High Strangers, another 4 issues. Doug Moench is back, except this time he's got Mark Texeira on pencils, which I like Mark Texeira. I collected some of his Ghost Rider back in the day, so I think he does great work here also because the story they tell, number one, they pick up a story that I think was pre-Moon Knight version 1 even, which I kind of just love when they do that. They pick up a story about this agency that Spector used to work for as a mercenary, this mind control program that they had going on. Stuff that kind of seems ridiculous on its surface, And it ends up being a commentary, I feel like, on all of the ridiculousness that has happened throughout the 90s to Moon Knight, even, let's say. And why I think Mark Texeira is a perfect complement to that is because his pencils are really heavy and realistic. I don't think is the right word, but it lends the right amount of weight to what this story is trying to do in the face of all of these weightless stories that have come before. So another huge recommendation for me on that, Moon Knight version 4, technically from 1999. Go check it out. Unfortunately, kind of the same thing happens. It doesn't stick. And I don't know if it was meant to or if that was always just going to be a 4-issue arc, but Moon Knight kind of disappears again for 7 years this time. He definitely doesn't have a solo book. He has some short appearances here and there, but for the most part, he takes a big long break, but comes back with, and it kind of only gets better from here on out, a book by Charlie Huston and David Finch in 2006, April of 2006, just Moon Knight version 5, and I went 12 issues deep into this. At first, it's Civil War era. That kind of gives you an idea for what the Marvel Comics stable is like at this point. And the reason this is so good is that it is one of the most brilliant recontextualizations of any character I think I've ever seen. Like, they go back, it feels like they read everything that I read up until that point, which again, we're in 2006, so they're already looking at 20, 30 years worth of comics. Went back, like, figured out all that stuff and figured out how to recontextualize it. And they do this within, gosh, I'm certainly within the first 12 issues, but I want to say within the first 6. It's a lot darker. It's straight up gory at times, so fair warning on that. Moon Knight himself is addicted to some sort of pills because Bushman has broken his legs, and I think this happens in between comics. I don't think there was a storyline that this is referencing with that. I think that's just where they decide to start this storyline. Frenchie is still in the mix. Marlene is back in the mix. Also Crawley, which I feel like I've never mentioned up until this point, but Crawley is this homeless person that deals more with Jake Lockley, which is an alternate identity of Moon Knight. His 3 identities have been Mark Spector, Jake Lockley, and Stephen Grant. Also, some stories treat Moon Knight himself as a 4th identity, which gets a little muddy over the years. Let's put it that way, and within some books. But here, they bring back Crawley, who only ever dealt with Jake Lockley, who was this cab driver that would go to a diner and talk to Gina, the person, who owned the diner, and it was almost a different book at that point, which I do also appreciate. That's, to me, when people have figured out what to do with the multiple identities, is they'll almost give them their own worlds, their own, rather than trying to do some weird mishmash. Anyway, that's not this book, actually, even though Crawley is back, and to some extent his multiple identities are back. They're more posited as a coping mechanism for all of the messed up stuff he does. Like, sometimes he'll blame it on one of the alters instead of, taking responsibility for it, honestly. So kind of everything I've talked about so far is in this book in one way or another. And when it shows up, I love it each and every time. I'm just like, oh, that's what they did with that this time. That's super cool. They figure out some of the messiest stuff from Moon Knight's past, kind of for the first time in a bit. Like, he's, I want to say, finally the religious zealot in this book that I've kind of been waiting for all this time. This might be the beginning of that. Khonshu is possibly an extra dimensional entity. If he's real at all, there's maybe a little bit less of a question mark as far as that goes. And if this is sounding all, again, a little bit dark, keep in mind the time that it did come out in 2001. It is maybe a little edgelordy. It's certainly the edgelordiest that Moon Knight ever gets. It might believe in vigilante violence a little too much at times. You kind of wonder if it's going a little bit too out on a limb, and not necessarily with the gore or nothing like that, but just as a philosophy, although without necessarily the Batman problem that I mentioned before. I do think they eke out an identity for Moon Knight himself as a hero and as a character here in this book fantastically. So It does go 30 issues though, so it's got kind of the same thing where it evolves over time. And I know 30 issues almost doesn't seem like a lot. Sometimes I can get through 30 issues in a few weeks or something like that, although it took me 2 years to do all of these books. Keep in mind though that that's almost 3 years as far as the book is concerned if these are coming out monthly. So it does evolve quite a bit. Texera comes back after some time and does a pretty good story. You get the feeling like maybe they were trying to revitalize the book in some way. I don't know if sales were slumping or what, but he returns with some really cool covers by Arthur Suydam, or Sudam, however you say that. But neither can actually save the book for the most part. It ends up being this really weird story where Mark Spector is killed, so he's just Jake Lockley after that. I'm like, I don't know if that's how that works. So They try and soft reboot it again in 2009 with Mike Benson doing some stories with Hefte Paulo on pencils and some very amazing covers by Gabriel Dell'Otto. And honestly, that story might be the best it's been since the beginning. It's just not particularly Moon Knight-y at all. It's just kind of a good story regardless. It could be anybody in the main character role there. So whatever the reasoning, if they knew the writing was on the wall or they were just going out with a bang, I don't know. The book ends at that point with issue 30. But again, I cannot recommend the Charlie Houston, David Finch run at the beginning of that book enough. It is amazing. It's like one of those books where you're reading it to the point where you forget to look at the pictures, and then you look and then you forget to read it at the same time. It's got so much going on and it's firing on all cylinders at once. So I almost think it couldn't get any better until 2 years later. And this, I get the feeling I did read somewhere, did not land at all. I think this was actually canceled. But in 2011, May of 2011, Moon Knight version 6, if you're counting, issue 1 through 12, this did only go for 12 issues, by Brian Michael Bendis and Alex Maleev, starts with this retelling of the entire origin story. So you think you're like, oh, here we go again. Let's see how they do it. And then that ends up being a TV show. Like it pulls out and it's actually a TV show being produced by Mark Spector. And then I think by the end of that issue, you realize that his alternate personalities now are Captain America, Spider-Man, and Wolverine. So they kind of redo the whole thing, and they're not overly concerned. Like that's why that intro with the TV show is so brilliant to me, is because they're not overly concerned with being like, okay, this is what Moon Knight is now. This is just like, and also it's the best version of, okay, if we have to do a origin of sorts, what if we do this? Like they figured all of that out, but then in making his alternate personalities those three other superheroes, as you can imagine, completely changes the story. And in so much that there's no Frenchie in this one, there's no Marlene even. In fact, his love interest for this book is Echo, and she's fantastic in this. They bring back the Night Shift, which was this team headed up by the Shroud that Moon Knight met once back in the 80s in a solo Avengers book, I want to say. So when he was in the West Coast Avengers, he had like a one-off in the back of another comic book. And they help him against what they call the Kingpin of LA. He's back in LA, by the way, for most of the books, but it ends up being Count Nefaria, which it's almost an enemy like that is out of Moon Knight's league and you wouldn't see in a Moon Knight book anyway. And they play that up and it works so well. This is written so well, but it also looks just absolutely gorgeous. And the one thing I will also call out is that for my money, in maybe one splash, they kind of figure out and do a decent portrayal of the multiple identity disorder, used to be multiple personality disorder, is now dissociative identity disorder is the real thing. And the way the comics have dealt with his multiple personality disorder, which I will call it because for the most part they treat it like that. They treat it like that pop psychiatry version, like you might have seen in a CSI or something like that. It's never been given a real nuanced or appropriate treatment as far as mental illness goes, let's say. In this, and it's issue number 7, I want to say, and again, like almost just one splash, and it's very few words, but captures, I think, finally, and with respect, this idea that he has mental issues. And it's still kind of comic booky in the way it does it. It's in reference to also being a superhero and stuff like that. So there's that to it. But again, I feel like if you're going to talk about dissociative identity disorder or mental illness in a comic book, unless you're making a comic book that's only about mental illness, like that's what it's there to treat and teach, I'm okay with a little bit of superhero mixed in, if, again, it's still done with respect. And here I think it is. So I wanted to call that out as well. It's not a clinical triumph, let's say, but it's pretty good and clears an admittedly low bar so far. And with that, we are going to skip ahead a few. That was Moon Knight version 6 for all intents and purposes in 2011. We're going to skip ahead to April of 2016 with what is Moon Knight version 8 for all intents and purposes, headed up by Jeff Lemire and Greg Smallwood. And it is also immediately good. And it would be a toss-up between this one and the Charlie Huston, David Finch run as to which one gets the recontextualization better. The David Finch and Charlie Huston run, it's more of a mathematical equation that they solve. Here, it's more of a, I can't believe nobody's done this yet in a way, because they take everything we know. Crawley's back, Gina, who is the person that owns the diner, Marlene is back, Frenchie is back, everybody's back to some extent, but we don't know if it's all in his head or not. We don't know if him being Moon Knight, him being a superhero and other stuff is completely made up in his head and he's actually just been in an insane asylum the whole time or not. So again, something I feel like maybe they flirted with here and there, but they've never had the guts to go 9 issues like this goes without answering that question. And this is taking place in like these faux, like space Egypt places that are probably inside of his head, but we also don't know completely. And since, again, Greg Smallwood is doing all of the art, it's gorgeous. It is another just everything on all cylinders. And it does all of that without the religiosity. So if that turned you off, you can kind of get your, which is good. I think it would have been kind of one too much for this book that is mostly concerned with, is Moon Knight crazy? Does all of this stuff you've been reading about for years exist or not? You get the feeling that they could have gone either way. Again, at some point, the answer could have been no. Like, we're starting over, and we're starting over with everything you've read, was in a snow globe or however that goes. Is that a St. Elsewhere reference? But it also does it in the way how I mentioned that when he's in his different personalities, it's kind of a different world, and each is given their own proper treatment. They do that here visually. It's not only made to be its own kind of world, if it's real, but it's also done in a completely different art style. And I'll be honest, I didn't find out if Greg Smallwood did each of those different palettes or if they got a different artist for each and every one. But either way, just fantastic storytelling and brilliant images. And it wraps up in a way that I'm not going to spoil maybe for the first time in this video. It does have to do with Khonshu because, again, the large question is whether or not, well, I guess not, the largest question is not whether or not Khonshu is real, but what if Khonshu was in charge of Mark Spector's mental illness, I guess, in a way. So absolutely check that out and maybe stop at issue 188. I forget the reasoning behind this every single time, but Marvel did the thing where they redid all of the issue numbers for like all of their books at some point. I don't know if that's because they went through, and again, after having been through all of these Moon Knight books, it's complete garbage that they would try this anyways, but it skips ahead to issue 188, but it's the same kind of run. But it's not the same kind of run because Max Bemis and Jason Burrows take over and kind of just fritter away the great work that Jeff Lemire and Greg Smallwood did up until that point. They re-trivialize his dissociative identity disorder. He's, I believe, switching personalities at will. They do some okay stuff with the Egyptian, like I think Ra becomes, the sun god becomes his, which makes sense, don't get me wrong, his nemesis at one point. And some of it looks really good also. But at the very least on the back of what Lemire and Smallwood did, it's kind of a real bummer that it turned into that. So fair warning as far as that goes too. And that's going to be the last thing I mention for now. So come back, I think, for the next one of these when I'm going to do an honorable mentions. I'm tempted to make it a Patreon thing or something, but I don't know. Go to Patreon, certainly. That's for sure, at patreon.com/Ryan_runs_. And you can throw $2 in the tip jar. It's not like $2 every month is like $24 every year. It's not a lot. It's not a lot. Try it. Try me. Internet.